Christina Tomlinson. I am currently the Director of Organizational Continuity Management. We call it OCM just because you got to take a couple breaths if you don't. And I work for the Pew Charitable Trusts. But I'm not here on representing the Pew Charitable Trust. I'm here as a representative of somebody whose profession is business continuity, crisis management. I also do travel risk management and fire life safety. And all of those are elements that every organization needs to have to some degree. But it's not generally stuff that you get classes about at the university or anywhere. There are some universities that have business continuity, crisis management programs now, but when I started, it didn't exist. So I couldn't have planned my trajectory. It was all accidental, basically, that I got to where I got to. So the presentation is Planning for the Inevitable, the Business Continuity Life Cycle. And I have a couple of, these are my notes, my talking points. First thing is a disclaimer, I am not a professional speaker. That is not my job. I don't have fancy PowerPoints. I prefer talking to people one-to-one, to be honest. The reason I wanted to do this, there's a couple. One is that I graduated from this school. I got my BA here and my MBA. I did the 3-2 program. And I got my first job through the job center here. And I went in to go do, I would always go in every day. I don't know how they do it now because it's all virtual, but I would go in every day I was on campus to see what jobs were posted that I might be able to apply for. And there was one, I had gotten to be friends with a woman at the desk, and there was one that came up that was US West, and I hadn't seen it and I hadn't signed up for it, but I asked her, do you think they could sneak me in? And they did. They agreed to let me come in and go through that process. And I'll just tell you this because it's a funny story. I thought, I got into the room and it was 4 men in suits sitting in a circle, and I sat down and a couple of them started asking me questions, and there was one guy sitting in the corner leaning back and I didn't say anything. And then towards the end of the interview, the guy in the back that hadn't said anything said, okay, so Christina, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I looked at him and I said, you're assuming I want to grow up. And they laughed, and I got the job. And I really think, I found out that the guy in the back with his arms crossed was the VP. But I swear, it was one of those things that I hadn't planned for. It just kind of fell in my lap, showed up when I needed to show up. And a lot of my career has been that way. My work history, so kind of my cred, is that I did 10 years working with US West, which here you'll know them now as CenturyLink. The name has changed. I started there. I did 10 years with TIAA-CREF, which is a financial management organization, a top 500. One of the largest ones. They do pension planning and investments for universities, hospitals, and museums. And then I'm now at the Pew Charitable Trusts, which is an NGO, non-government organization in Washington, D.C. So I've worked in places where it was highly regulated, and you had the SEC coming in to review your business continuity plans and crisis management plans. And then at the Pew Charitable Trusts, the reason we have business continuity is not because it's regulated, because it makes sense, and because our board of directors wanted it. So there's all sorts of different versions of business continuity, from huge programs with 30 people to little programs like mine with 2 people and about 80 dotted line people that I don't actually have to supervise, but who do some of the work. So the reason why it's important to have business continuity, and I guess it's really hard to see that one, but this is something that's put out on an annual basis, and it's an assessment of the kind of risks that businesses or organizations are subject to and what they think are the most critical and most likely to cause problems. The top one that it's a little bit hard to read is cyber attack and data breach. So that is the one that they're predicting is going to have the highest impact and happen most often these days. Because we know it's happening every day to just about every organization to some degree. Right? And then there's the lone attacker, the shooter incident, critical infrastructure failures. We saw power outages. We've had, that's happening all over the country, all over the world, where there's not enough power to provide HVAC and people are dying from heat stroke and lack of talent. And that is a huge one that's going on now. We had the Great Resignation, and then the silent resignation, and then and now they're starting to hire again. So just being in an organization that doesn't have the skill sets that they need to be successful. So these are just some of the risks, and I share these because we oftentimes think of it's always like a weather pattern type event. It's a hurricane, it's a tornado, it's a wildfire. All those things can happen too. There's a lot of things that go on, and when an organization is impacted, they have to be able to recover from that. I mean, we've all seen all the restaurants and businesses and apartments that were being built and then they stopped because they can't get the supplies. There's always impacts that happen around the world and to all organizations. And if you're prepared, if you've planned ahead, then you're much more likely to be able to survive, right, and continue to be a healthy organization. When I talk about business continuity, I have kind of a pretty specific description of what that is, but it all works with all the other pieces that you would think of that have to do with planning and response to emergency or impactful situations, right? In most organizations, what that looks like in real life is that they will have, for their staff, right, or students, staff and students in this case, right, you've got fire and life safety, evacuation procedures, emergency communication testing that goes on. For many organizations where they have people traveling all over the world, Pew is one of them. We have a travel risk management program. Those are the ways that we take care of and try to keep our staff safe. Then for our sites, our office buildings, not everybody has those anymore, but we have physical security. We have security systems. We have emergency response training, evacuation, shelter in place, procedures that the property management people have to do when things happen, like shutting down outside air to the building so that if there's smoke in the air, you're not bringing it into your building. There's just a lot of things that we do to protect our sites. From the perspective of data and networks and applications, right? And these are all things that you guys have, by the way, here and probably everywhere you've ever worked to some degree, or you should have had. For data and networks, you have cybersecurity programs, you have disaster recovery plans, and they're always monitoring 24/7/365. We're moving everything to the cloud, and then now we're putting everything in 3 clouds, just in case one cloud doesn't. I mean, it's a lot. But our reliance on technology, especially now that we've all got, so many companies are going remotely, has expanded tremendously. Right. And then the piece that we have in place to protect the work that we do, right? It's not emergency response, it's not fire life safety, and it's not crisis management. It's business continuity. It's how do we find ways to get past whatever the disruption is and keep going with what it is we need to do. So I always think of business continuity as kind of your plan B, right? If I can't do this, what am I gonna do? Right? And so, although I have responsibility in my organization for all of those pieces, fire, life safety, crisis management, I don't do disaster recovery. That's all the IT side of the house. I'm talking to you here today about business continuity because it's the fundamental piece that needs to be in place. It's like the plan you put in place before you build a house, right? You kind of want to know what goes in first, where the structures need to be the strongest, the roof is going to work, that kind of stuff. If there's questions, by the way, feel free, because otherwise you're just going to hear me. So business continuity, this is the best definition that I've ever found. It's the ongoing management and governance process supported by top management and appropriately resourced to ensure that the necessary steps are taken to identify the impact of potential losses, maintain viable recovery strategies and plans, and ensure continuity of products and services through training, exercises, maintenance, and review. And that's why it's a life cycle, because it keeps changing, right? And you have to keep going back and looking at it again and again. It gets much easier once you've got all the fundamental pieces in place. Then you're just looking to see where the gaps are and where you need to repair and where you're going to build on an extra room, right? So the BC life cycle itself has three major components. And I will tell you that one of the things that I love the most about doing business continuity, everywhere I've done it, is you get insight into every single department at a level that otherwise you would never see. Because the thing that you start out with in business continuity planning is you do a business impact analysis, a BIA. So you whether you have a large department or you do it individually, whether you use a software package to collect the data, because there's a lot of softwares that support business continuity, or if you just use Excel spreadsheets. The first step is to go through with each department and have them identify what are the business functions that they perform. So you can imagine in finance, they're going to tell you, well, we pay bills, we pay salaries, we do, we work with the vendors. They'll identify what are the functions they do in that organization. HR will have a whole different set of business functions. Each department will have a set of business functions. And in my mind, the best way to do it is to tell them, we only want describe the business function you do that's within your piece of the business. So not the process, not the end-to-end process, because payroll is going to involve HR and finance, etc. Right? It goes across departments. But when you first do a BIA, you just do it within the organization. So within your own walls, what are the business functions you perform? You identify those, and then you go and you ask them, and again, I use a software product to do it because it makes it really easy, right? You ask them, so this business function that we're talking about, right? If it's business continuity planning, which is one of my business functions, I'm going to look at, so what are the things I rely on? What are my dependencies to perform that business function? Like I said, this is the foundation of all of business continuity once you know that. What vendors do I rely on, right? What applications do I have to use? Where is my data stored, right? What locations do I have staff at? Do I have any business functions that only have one staff member, a single point of failure, right? It might be very cool to be the expert and the only one who knows how to do something. That's some job security. But if you're gone, you are now the single point of failure, right? But organizations won't look at that generally. Right? But this forces an organization to look at all those pieces, and then you identify what the recovery time objective is, and that means you identify at what point, from a business perspective, not an IT perspective, at what point in time are you going to start really feeling some pain if you cannot perform that business function. And the comparison I'll give you is I do crisis management and business continuity. Crisis management, I need to be able to do that within a matter of hours, right? Because I'm dealing with a crisis. Something has to happen fast. Business continuity planning, if I have my plans in place, then I can go weeks without doing business continuity planning because it's already done. And so every business function, you take them through the process of kind of rating and ranking how quickly they need to get something up and running again. And the things that we look at when we're doing that kind of assessment to determine what the recovery time objective is, we look at what is the impact to sales going to be, if that's relevant to you. What's your, do you have regulatory issues that are going to come up if you're not able to perform that function for a certain period of time? Is it going to impact operations as a whole? Okay. The top one, the first one that we ever ask is, are staff going to be impacted? Are they going to be unable to function, right? So you use that same framework across every business function, and then you end up with this fabulous report that says, here's the top things that we need to recover in the first 24 hours. Right? And we have it across the whole organization. I've got 670 business functions that have been identified. But I am one of the few people in the entire company who can tell you across all departments which ones are most critical. Right? So, I tell this to people at Pew where I work that, one of the first things you should do as a new employee is get a look at your business continuity plan and your business continuity functions, because you will learn more about what they do from that than you will learn in the first 3 months of working there. Because it's all documented. It's right there. So it becomes a really powerful tool. We also take those RTOs and assign them to the various pieces, like the applications, because we're also trying to determine which applications do you need to have recovered before others, right? And at what point in time. So you can use the ratings for the business function and that relationship the business function has to the applications they have to use, and then you do a calculus of, okay, so there might be 7 different business functions that use a certain application. The shortest RTO of all those business functions is a P0, meaning it has to be recovered in 0 to 24 hours, and that becomes the RTO that the application inherits. Then you take that information and give it to IT and say, this is what the business wants. Now, the IT always has this there's always an issue where they call it a recovery time objective as well that they have on the IT side. I call it a recovery time capability. Because the business should set the objective. The capability is what IT builds out. And then you do a comparison, right? And with that data, you can figure out whether you're going to be able to recover. IT can use that information to design their disaster recovery plans. So it's just an amazing piece of information, a process for gathering information that can become used in all of the various departments at different times. The other thing that we do now is, can this business function be performed remotely? Right? Sound familiar, anybody? Because there's a lot of things that you cannot do remotely. And so you have to plan differently for those. And then determine what the peak processing times are. And that's going to apply generally more often in the finance or regulatory environment, right? Where you have to send in your tax report monthly, or you have to, there's an annual thing that you have to do. So those are the peak processing times. The way that we do it is, once the BIAs are done, we create reports for leadership, and we make them review them and sign off on them, because they are then responsible at the leadership level for approving that and agreeing that those are the most critical business functions. Once we have that, we use those business functions to determine what we're going to do in our business continuity plan. So again, that's our foundation, and that is some incredibly powerful data, because you can do the same thing with applications, you can do it with vendors as well. So who are our most critical vendors? The next phase of business continuity plan is actually doing the plan itself. Right? So it's a document. The value of doing a business continuity plan is almost entirely in the planning piece, because oftentimes you won't even open that plan when something happens, because you have already determined what you're going to do and everybody's familiar with it. Right? You don't have to open a book when it's time to evacuate the building. You've been trained, you know what to do, you know where the doors are, right? But for building a business continuity plan, my recommendation is, I like using a business continuity software, because then I can just push out access to the software to all of the planners, right? So we have 2 planners for every department that dotted line to me for this work. And you build the template in the software to collect the rest of the information you need. And the rest of the information you need is things like who's going to be on the team, right? What are the impact categories you're going to address, and what are the tasks that you have to perform. In You'll hear this quite a bit in whether you're talking emergency management or business continuity, but when we look at impact categories, we are not looking at impact scenarios from the perspective of what do you do if it's a tornado, or what do you do if it's a flood, or what do you do if it's COVID. We look at impact categories as what do you do if your site's not available. I don't care what the reason is, right? It could be anything that causes the site not to be available. What do you do if staff aren't available? So, in many ways we were very fortunate with COVID. We lost more people than we ever should have, but most organizations still had enough staff to go forward. They just had to work differently. But if you had the kind of, an event that took people out and made them unavailable to you, how are you going to manage that? What are you going to do if the network's not available, your IT's not available? So those are what I call impact categories. It's not tied to scenarios. If you ever start planning based on a scenario, you have just shifted into emergency management. Because remember, this is the planning piece. And once you've identified those impact categories that you're concerned about, within each plan, you identify what your strategies are. So if my site's not available, I'm going to send people to work from home. If my work from home site, because now we do both, is not available, I'm going to send people back to the office. That's pretty easy. Didn't used to be that easy because they didn't offer the ability to work remotely. But let's say your staff's not available. Then what are you going to do? You're going to get temporary staff, or you're going to pull people back who used to do that job and know how to do it. Or you're going to go, you know what, I'm in bad shape, I'm going to do some cross-training. Okay? I need more people that can perform this function so that if that happens, I've got better coverage. And then once the plan template is built, then you push it out and you let the departments do it, because there are organizations that have a lot of people on their staff who go out and interview. They sit down with the director of finance and ask them all these questions and write it all down, and then they go put it in the system. We're a small organization. There's me and one other person that does all of this, and so we push it out. We'd rather train them to use the tool than interview them and gather the data. And in this world, people today are pretty good about adopting new applications if they're decent. And there's some really good applications out there. Once the plans are in place, then we move into the exercise piece. And whenever you're working with a business continuity plan, the first thing you want to do is what we call a walkthrough exercise. It's where you get all the people together you identified on the team for that business continuity plan. And you sit them down and you tell them what the scenario is. This has just happened, your office building is not available, and it won't be for another 6 months, and nobody's allowed in, and then what are you going to do, right? We did that one, thank God, the year before COVID, and everybody practiced working remotely. And when COVID hit, we were able to transition from everybody on site 5 days a week to everybody remote within a week. 800 people. It was pretty amazing. But it would never have happened that easily if we hadn't practiced. So you do the walkthrough, which again is everybody just talking at a table, going through the plan. What did we say we would do? Is that really what we do? Did you think about this? And that's the first exercise you do. And you can do various levels of exercises. The walkthrough is the easiest of them all. And then you can start getting a little more complex, like where you actually have them, you say these 4 people from your 10-person department are unavailable. What are you going to do? Right? That one's pretty easy. We have our programmatic side of the house is 500 people. Right? If you lose 40% of your staff, what are you going to do? Right? And then it gets a little bit more difficult and more interesting, and the conversations. What you don't want to do is do a scenario that's so hard that they just go, well, I'm just going to go home till it's over, because there's nothing I can do. And then, I was already talking about that. And then once you're done with the testing, you have to give them a way to document the testing, right? I strongly encourage, if you ever get into this field, you make them document it via the software so that it's right there at the time of the test, because otherwise they'll wait 3 months and then they can't remember what they said they were going to do, right? And then at the end of that cycle, we have a system to send out the business continuity plan and the testing documentation, again, back to the leadership level, and they have to review and approve or provide feedback, which means they buy into it, and hopefully, if we get to a point where we're actually having to activate because of a major event, our the people that manage the business continuity plans can activate their plans. The crisis management team comes together and negotiates and coordinates across the departments, and it all works together. I'm done. Questions?
I've got one. So I think this is phase one. So when you're trying to calculate which business functions should be addressed first,
Yeah.
What are some of these parameters that are being utilized? Like, what's this algorithm look like? And then also, is that changing then with different scenarios?
You could, that would get very complex, and what I found is you get a baseline and you ask them to rate and rank the business function based on a normal day.
Okay.
Like not a peak period and but just a normal day, because what you're really trying to get a comparison that's kind of even across the bar, across all of the departments. And then, as I said, we use there's a number of questions that we ask, and then they have a drop down of what they can pick.
Mm-hmm.
So you say, at what point in time would you start to have financial impact to the company? And you can pick 0 to 24 hours, 1 to 5 days, 5 to 15 days, 1 month. And so we keep it high level. Now, in some organizations where it's easy, well, it's never easy, where you can actually document a value, like if you stop selling, if you stop manufacturing, you can have an amount of money that's going to be lost, then you can make those criteria to be, buckets of money instead of just the time, or they can associate it that way. That is complex and requires a lot of knowledge. It's very difficult to do, and it's usually when people go screaming from the room. Right. And then you lose the value because you don't ever use that data. But if you know what's most important, and then leadership agrees it's most important, that's really what you need. Not a report of, well, I'm losing $10,000 a minute. Right? It's too late if that's the case, and you don't know that already. You don't, right? Any other questions? That was a good one. Thank you.
I work in healthcare, and in risk management, one question that frequently comes up is that, there are some really unique occurrences that preparing for would be really time and energy and resource consuming. So from, risk management perspective, to what extent is acceptable to say, well, the likelihood of this event happening is low, multiplying that by its, frequency times its the cost to prepare for it. The math is not doing anything about it.
Right.
Over, putting a lot of money and resources, because it's a very unique occurrence.
That is an issue that we've always had to deal with in risk management, because you have people that want to plan for the zombie apocalypse, right? I mean, we've all done that, and it's a fun exercise to do, but it's, really unlikely to happen. And you could spend thousands and thousands of dollars planning for something that's very unlikely. I think my opinion is you plan for the things that are critical on a day-to-day basis. The work that is done on a day-to-day, like in an emergency room, you should have fabulous business continuity plans, right? And in a hospital situation where you're going to have to move people, those are things that are day-to-day that you need to be able to have a plan B for.
Probably business continuity and emergency management is pretty prevalent in healthcare settings, but there's a lot of industries where business continuity planning doesn't yet exist,
Right.
Or you don't find people like yourself in a lot of businesses or business industries. Where in your opinion are there gaps that where would it make sense going forward for people in your roles to be
infiltrate?
Yeah.
How do we infiltrate these other organizations?
Like where does it make sense?
I'll tell you, COVID has done a lot because so many organizations, it was the first time where they really had to deal with something they were not ready to deal with. It wasn't your average kind of event. And they saw the difference that happens when you have the ability to work remotely. And that's one of the biggest impact categories we've ever worked on is your site's unavailable. Right? So for a lot of organizations, that's almost solved. But they also saw that not having a plan meant it took months and months and months to get to another level of comfort. Not back to normal, because I don't think we're ever getting back to normal, but to get back to a place where you felt like it was at least kind of run the railroad, right? So if you look out at some of the sites, and we're going to provide the slides to you, but there are so many jobs in business continuity. The problem is most of them require some work in that area. And so paying attention to, looking at the risk management organization, if you go into an organization, you get a job with somebody, ask them about risk management, ask them if they have business continuity and emergency management. Because, like I said, there's not a lot of schools that will train you on that. But you can get trained if you just kind of volunteer for the roles and let them know that you're interested in it. Then there's a whole bunch of associations, because business continuity started as disaster recovery, right? Because it was all, we've got IT now, we've got to be able to recover our data, right? And then it was like, well, it's more than just the data that we need. We need the people and the sites and the other. So then it moved into business continuity. And then it became a regulation, a requirement, right? So any organization that is considered critical infrastructure, power plants, communications, water, supply chain stuff now is starting to be requiring to have business continuity plans. It's just expanded dramatically. So there's a ton of jobs out there if you can just get your foot in the door. And for me, I got to a level I never expected I would get to. I mean, like, as I said, I didn't even know business continuity existed. Somebody overheard me at US West tell them I was telling my boss that I didn't feel challenged. And they had just enacted the regulations that all of the communications companies had to have business continuity plans. So I was a victim of, and the grace of, give it to the new kid. And that's how I got it. And there wasn't any place to go. I mean, I went through these associations to learn what it was I was supposed to be doing and what it was supposed to look like. So there's a lot of different groups out there that do business continuity, that have meetings monthly with other business continuity planners. Those associations are so powerful. And those are really some of the best ways to get into an organization, is through those associations.
What's usually the background of people in this field?
There's a real mix. There's emergency management is one. There's risk management is another. I've seen in some organizations it starts out more under facility management. And then they realize, well, it's great that we can bring the building back, but nobody knows how to do their job now. Mm-hmm. So it can come up different ways. Any other questions? How am I doing on time? I'm sorry, I wasn't even paying attention. Pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, pretty good. One thing I do want to share with you is with these associations, there's another one. If you're at all interested in cyber, right, or in the IT, there's an organization called InfraGuard, which is a public-private partnership between the FBI and critical infrastructure. It was created right after 9/11, but it's really open to anybody. You do have to get a first level of security clearance. It's free. There are associations in almost every state, and there's a national association. And they provide information about cyber attacks. They provide all sorts of training in the IT field. I'm not an IT person, but I'm telling you, if you want to make a really good living, learn IT and cyber, and there's no charge, right? And having that on your resume is pretty powerful as well. So, you know, for a couple of years I was the president of the Southern Nevada chapter. Right? That looks pretty good. Any other questions? The only other thing I would share is if you want to learn anything about the Pew Charitable Trusts, well, first let me ask you this. Do you know what the Pew Research Center is? You heard that? There's some nods in there. Pew Research Center is quoted multiple times a day in almost every newspaper because they do research, they do surveys, they have all sorts of information. It's very nonpartisan. That's part of the Pew Charitable Trusts. Pew Charitable Trusts does work in environmental and medical. We do work in looking at the jail system, and the website is pewtrusts.org, and it is a fabulous organization. It's 75 years old, and when I was in school, nobody ever pointed me to an NGO to look for work, but it is one of the best places to work. They're very people-oriented. They have a mission. I'm proud that I'm protecting the people that do that work, that are saving the world. So keep NGOs in mind, and there's some great sites out there with jobs listings that just NGOs put job listings on. But none of you need jobs, so maybe somebody watches the tape well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christina.